The clock on the chapel wall struck 4, and Edward Colton felt his hands go cold in his lap. 200 guests sat behind him in perfect rows of white chairs, and not one of them dared to whisper. The doors at the end of the aisle stood open, framing an empty courtyard where the bride should have been standing. She was not there. Edward gripped the wheels of his chair, his knuckles pale, his jaw tight. He had built an empire out of patience. He had survived betrayal, gunfire, and the day his own legs stopped working beneath him. But nothing had prepared him for this kind of silence, the kind that grows heavier with every second, the kind that makes 200 powerful men and women shift uncomfortably in their seats, because they can all sense that something has gone terribly wrong. His best man, Henry Voss, leaned down beside him, speaking low enough that only Edward could hear. "Her car left the hotel 40 minutes ago," Henry said. "It should have been here by now." "Then find out where it is," Edward said, his voice steady, even though his mind was racing. A man in his position did not have the luxury of panic. Panic was for men who had never learned to expect the worst. Henry nodded and disappeared through the side door, phone already pressed to his ear. Edward looked out at the guests. Some were old friends. Some were men he had once considered enemies. Men who had come today under a fragile truce, a promise that no matter what happened between their families, this one day would remain peaceful. He watched their faces now, searching for any flicker of satisfaction, any hint that one of them knew something he did not. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment was not when a threat announced itself, but when everyone in the room suddenly grew quiet at the same time. A woman near the back stood up slowly. It was Charlotte Reyes, the bride's aunt, her face pale beneath her makeup. She caught Edward's eye for just a moment before looking away and slipping out through a side door of her own. That was the first sign. Edward had not always been the man sitting in this chair. 6 years earlier, he had walked into every room he entered, tall, sure of himself, feared by men twice his size. He ran the import business that supplied half the city, and everyone who mattered in that world knew his name. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, his car had spun off the road during a routine drive to his warehouse. The official story was a mechanical failure. Edward knew better. He had made enemies, and someone had decided the easiest way to remove him from the game was not to confront him, but to make sure he never walked again. He survived. His legs did not. For the first year, he barely left his house. The men who once respected him began to whisper that a broken king could not hold his throne, that it was only a matter of time before someone stronger stepped in to take his place. Edward heard every rumor. He let his enemies believe he was finished. And while they celebrated too early, he rebuilt his network from a wheelchair in a quiet room, proving over and over that his mind had never been broken at all, only his body. It was during that long, slow climb back to power that he had met Isabel Hart. She was different from the women who usually surrounded men like him. She did not flinch when she saw the wheelchair. She spoke to him like an equal, teased him without fear, and made him laugh in a way he had almost forgotten how to do. Within months, he was certain he had found something real, something no accident could ever take from him. His closest advisors warned him gently that her family had unclear connections, that no one seemed to know much about where her money came from. Edward brushed off every warning. He was tired of living behind walls of suspicion. He wanted for once to simply be happy. Now, sitting in that chapel with the doors open to an empty courtyard, all of those warnings came rushing back at once. Henry returned, his face grim. "Her phone is off," he said. "The driver isn't answering either." "Send someone to the hotel," Edward said quietly. "Now." Guests had begun murmuring among themselves, no longer able to hold their silence. A few reached for their own phones, perhaps sensing an opportunity to leave gracefully, before whatever was happening became a scandal too big to walk away from cleanly. Edward watched the room shift beneath him like sand, and for the first time since the accident, he felt truly powerless, not because of his legs, but because the one person he had allowed himself to fully trust had simply vanished on the one day that mattered most. He thought of every version of what could have happened: a last-minute fear, a change of heart, an accident on the road, the same kind of accident that had once taken his ability to walk. Each possibility circled through his mind, and none of them offered any comfort. Then he noticed her, standing quietly near the side wall of the chapel, Half hidden behind a column of white flowers was Grace Turner, the woman who had managed his household for the past 3 years. She was not a guest. She was staff, dressed simply, holding a small clipboard she used to track the day's arrangements. She was not looking at the empty courtyard like everyone else. She was looking directly at him. Edward had barely spoken to Grace beyond simple instructions in all the time she had worked in his home. She was efficient, quiet, and almost invisible in the way that good staff often are, present everywhere and noticed nowhere. Yet in this moment, surrounded by powerful people who suddenly seemed unsure of what to do, she was the only person in the room who looked calm. She began walking toward him. Henry moved to intercept her out of habit, the way any man responsible for security instinctively steps between his employer and anyone approaching during a moment of uncertainty. Edward raised a hand slightly, stopping him. Something in Grace's expression told him this was not the moment to turn her away. She reached his side and knelt down so that her eyes were level with his, something almost no one in his life ever bothered to do. "Mr. Colton," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos rising around them, "before anyone else asks you where she is, I need to ask you something else first." Edward studied her face. Behind them, the murmuring guests had grown louder, and somewhere near the entrance, he could hear the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming shut in a hurry. "Ask me," he said. Grace glanced once toward the open doors, then back at him, and what she said next was not the question anyone in that chapel expected to hear. "Did you ever ask yourself why a woman like her fell for a man in a wheelchair so quickly, without once asking about your condition, your recovery, or your pain? Not once, in over a year, did she ask you how you were really doing." The words landed like a splash of cold water. Edward opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Around them, the noise of the chapel had grown into a low roar of confused voices, but for a moment, it all seemed to fade into the background. He searched his memory, running back through every conversation he had shared with Isabel, every quiet evening, every laugh, every promise. Grace was right. She had never asked. Not about the accident, not about the long nights of therapy, not about the fear that had followed him ever since the crash. She had only ever asked about his plans, his properties, his business partners, and the men who answered to him. "What do you know?" Edward said, his voice low. "That I don't?" Grace hesitated only for a second before answering. "I know that the car she was riding in this morning was not going toward the chapel," she said. "It was heading in the opposite direction, toward the old harbor road. I know because I followed it myself, an hour before the ceremony was supposed to begin." Henry, standing close enough to hear, stiffened. "You followed the bride?" "I followed a car that left before dawn carrying 2 men I did not recognize," Grace said, not breaking eye contact with Edward. "Men who came to the house twice last month when you were resting upstairs. Men who never gave their names to the staff, and who always left through the back gate instead of the front." Edward felt something tighten in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced since the weeks right after the accident, the feeling of the ground shifting beneath him without warning. 3 years earlier, when Grace Turner first came to work in his household, she had been recommended by a family friend who assured Edward she was reliable, discreet, and unshakable under pressure. She had worked in wealthy homes before, managing schedules, deliveries, and the quiet details that kept a large estate running smoothly. Edward had barely looked twice at her during the interview, distracted at the time by business matters that felt far more urgent. She had simply become part of the background of his life, the woman who made sure his morning coffee was ready, who kept his medical appointments organized, who noticed when his mood had darkened and quietly adjusted the household around him without ever asking why. It was strange now to realize that the person who had spent 3 years fading into the walls of his home was the only one who had been paying close enough attention to notice what everyone else had missed. "Start from the beginning," Edward said. "Tell me everything." Grace stood, smoothing her dress, and glanced once more toward the chapel entrance where guests were beginning to whisper louder, some already reaching for coats, uncertain whether to stay or leave. She lowered her voice further. 6 weeks ago, I noticed a car parked outside the estate gates most mornings. Always the same model, always leaving before the household staff arrived for the day, she said. At first, I assumed it belonged to a neighbor. Then I noticed it again outside Isabel's hotel. the one she insisted on staying at during the final weeks before the wedding, even though your home has more than enough room for her. I began paying closer attention, not because I suspected anything at first, simply because it is my habit to notice patterns. She continued, her tone calm and measured despite the urgency of the moment, describing how she had begun keeping a small notebook, nothing dramatic, simply jotting down times, license plates, and small details that seemed unusual. She described the two men who visited the house last month, always arriving separately, always leaving through the service entrance rather than the front door like proper guests. She described overhearing a phone call through a partially open door, Isabel's voice lowered to a near whisper, speaking about paperwork and timing, and something about how everything needed to be finalized before the ceremony, not after. I did not understand what it meant at first, Grace admitted. I told myself it was simply wedding planning, nerves, last-minute details, but then I heard her mention your name and the word inheritance in the same sentence. Edward's chest tightened further. He had signed documents only weeks earlier updating his estate, a routine matter his lawyer had handled quietly, transferring certain business interests into a joint arrangement as part of the marriage preparations, a gesture of trust he had insisted on, despite gentle objections from his financial advisor. At the time, it had felt like proof of his commitment, a way of showing Isabel that he was not simply using his position to keep her at arm's length. Now, hearing Grace describe a conversation about inheritance and timing, the gesture felt less like trust and more like a trap he had built with his own hands. "You should have told me this before today," Edward said, though his voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. "I tried," Grace said simply. "3 times over the past 2 weeks, I asked to speak with you privately. Each time you were occupied with wedding arrangements, or Isabel was present, or Henry assumed I only wanted to discuss household budgets and rescheduled me for another day. I am not a person people expect to have anything urgent to say, Mr. Colton. I have spent years being the quiet one in the room. I did not know how to make anyone listen until the moment was already this close." Henry looked uncomfortable, clearly remembering the rescheduled meetings, but there was no time to dwell on missed opportunities. Outside, the sound of a car engine grew louder, tires crunching against gravel as it approached the chapel entrance, far too quickly for a wedding day arrival. Edward turned his chair toward the sound, his pulse quickening. "Who is that?" Grace's expression tightened. "That is not part of the wedding plan," she said. "No one was scheduled to arrive after 4 o'clock. The gate guards were told to hold all vehicles until the ceremony concluded." Henry was already moving, one hand reaching beneath his jacket out of old habit, though he stopped himself, remembering the truce, remembering the 200 guests seated behind them, remembering that any wrong move today could shatter a fragile peace between families who had agreed only to lay down their guard for a single afternoon. He instead moved quickly toward the chapel entrance, motioning for 2 of the security staff positioned discreetly near the flower arrangements to follow him. Edward remained seated, Grace still beside him, both watching the doorway as the sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the marble floor. A man in a plain dark suit appeared at the entrance, breathing hard, clearly having run some distance. He was not a guest. Edward recognized him immediately as one of the drivers assigned to the wedding transportation team, a young man named Oliver Banks, who had been hired specifically to escort Isabel from the hotel that morning. Oliver's eyes swept the room until he found Edward, and the look on his face told everyone present, guests included, that whatever news he carried was not good. "Mr. Colton," Oliver said, struggling to catch his breath, "I need to speak with you. It's about the bride's car." The chapel fell into complete silence, 200 guests holding their breath at once, waiting to hear whatever this frightened young driver had come to say. Oliver stepped closer, glancing nervously at the crowd before lowering his voice, though the room was so quiet that Edward suspected everyone could still hear at least part of what he said next. "The car she was riding in this morning was not the one assigned by our company," Oliver said. "Someone swapped the vehicle overnight, at the hotel garage. I only noticed because the license plate didn't match our fleet records. I tried calling the office, but by the time anyone answered, the car had already left the city limits." Edward felt the floor tilt beneath him again, though he had not moved an inch. Grace remained calm beside him, her earlier suspicions now confirmed in the worst possible way. Henry returned to Edward's side, his face pale. If the car was swapped, Henry said slowly, then Isabel never had control over where she was actually going. Or, Grace said quietly, she knew exactly where she was going, and simply never intended for anyone else to find out until it was too late to stop it. Edward looked between the two of them, the weight of the moment pressing down harder than anything he had felt since the day the accident took his legs. Somewhere out there, his bride, or perhaps someone pretending to be his bride's ally, had orchestrated a disappearance timed perfectly to the one day when every rival, every ally, and every enemy he had ever made would be gathered in one place, distracted, celebrating, and utterly unprepared for whatever was about to happen next. "Get everyone in this chapel calm," Edward said, his voice hardening into the tone he had once used to command an entire criminal network from behind closed doors, a tone that had not surfaced in years, but returned now without hesitation. "Nobody leaves until we understand what we are dealing with. Henry, seal the gates quietly. No announcements, no panic. Grace, you're coming with me. You clearly know more about the last 6 weeks of my own life than I do, and I intend to hear every last detail before this day is finished." Grace nodded once, and for the first time since the ceremony had unraveled, Edward saw something steady take hold of the chaos. Not because the danger had passed, but because for the first time in years, he was no longer walking blindly into it alone. They moved to a private study just off the main hall, away from the murmuring crowd, where Henry had already gathered 2 of the security staff and a laptop connected to the estate's camera network. Grace pulled a small notebook from her bag, its pages filled with neat handwriting, dates, times, and license plate numbers recorded over the past 6 weeks. Edward studied the pages while Henry pulled up footage from the front gate camera. "There," Henry said, pointing at the screen. 6:15 this morning. That's the car Oliver mentioned, the one that doesn't match our fleet records." The footage showed a dark sedan pulling away from the hotel entrance with Isabel stepping inside, calm, composed, dressed for the day ahead, showing no sign of distress or hesitation. Edward felt his stomach turn. Whatever was happening, she had not been taken against her will. She had walked into that car on her own. "Play it again," Edward said quietly. Henry replayed the clip. This time, Edward noticed something he had missed before. A small leather bag Isabel carried herself into the car, one she had never mentioned packing for the wedding day, one that seemed far too large for a simple morning ceremony. "She wasn't planning on coming back here afterward," Grace said, voicing the thought that had already settled cold in Edward's chest. Whatever happens next, she planned to be somewhere else by tonight. Henry traced the sedan's route using traffic cameras along the main roads leaving the estate, following it block by block until the trail led toward the old harbor district, an area of the city Edward knew well, once home to several of his own warehouses before he consolidated operations closer to downtown. The harbor had grown quiet over the years, most of its old buildings abandoned or repurposed, a place easy to disappear into if someone wanted privacy away from prying eyes. "Why the harbor?" Henry muttered, almost to himself. Edward already knew the answer, though it took shape slowly in his mind, piece by piece. The way a puzzle reveals its picture only once, enough pieces click into place. Years earlier, before the accident, one of his fiercest rivals in the shipping business had been a man named Marcus Doyle, a name Edward had not heard mentioned in nearly 5 years, ever since Doyle's operation collapsed following a string of failed deals and internal disputes. Doyle had vanished from the city entirely after losing almost everything, rumored to have fled somewhere overseas to avoid the debts and enemies he left behind. "Pull up anything connected to Doyle," Edward said. "Old records, associates, family." Henry typed quickly, cross-referencing old files the estate kept on past business rivals, information gathered over years as simple precaution rather than active surveillance. After a few tense minutes, a photograph appeared on the screen, an old newspaper clipping from a business event years earlier, showing Marcus Doyle standing beside a much younger woman, identified in the caption as his niece. The woman in the photograph, despite being younger and dressed differently, was unmistakably Isabel. The room went silent. Edward stared at the screen, feeling something between anger and disbelief settle over him. He had spent over a year with a woman whose family had every reason in the world to want him removed from power, and not once had she given any indication of the connection. She used a different last name when you met her, Grace said, filling in details from her own research. Hart is not her birth name. I found records suggesting she changed it legally almost 2 years ago, shortly before she was introduced to your social circle through a mutual acquaintance who, as far as I can tell, may not have been entirely innocent in arranging that introduction either. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to breathe slowly, the way his therapist had once taught him to manage pain in the months after the accident. This was not physical pain, but it struck just as deeply, the realization that an entire year of his life, an entire relationship he believed to be genuine, had been carefully constructed from the very beginning. If Doyle lost everything years ago, Henry said slowly, working through the logic aloud, then this isn't just about revenge. It's about rebuilding what he lost, using your empire to do it. The paperwork, Edward said suddenly, remembering the estate documents his lawyer had prepared weeks earlier. The joint arrangement, the transfer of business interests. If that marriage certificate had been signed today, how much of my operation would have transferred into her name? Grace flipped through her notebook until she found a page where she had copied, as best she could without proper legal training, portions of language she overheard during a phone call Isabel made from the estate's garden weeks earlier, a call Grace had only caught fragments of while trimming nearby roses. Enough, Grace said. Enough that within a year, control of your shipping contracts, your warehouse leases, and 2 of your 3 primary business accounts would have shifted to joint ownership, with provisions allowing full transfer under certain conditions. What conditions? Edward asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer before Grace spoke it aloud. Incapacitation, Grace said quietly, or worse. The room fell silent again, heavier this time. Edward understood now why Isabel had never asked about his recovery, his pain, or his fears. She had not needed to understand the man behind the empire. She had only needed him to sign the right documents and trust her enough not to look closer until it was too late. Outside the study, the sound of raised voices drifted down the hallway from the main chapel, guests growing restless, some of the visiting bosses clearly unwilling to wait much longer without answers. Edward knew the truce holding this room together was fragile at best, built on the assumption that today would proceed as planned, a peaceful gathering meant to solidify alliances rather than expose weaknesses. If word spread that his own bride had been part of an elaborate plan to seize his empire, some of the men currently seated in that chapel might see this not as tragedy, but as opportunity. "We need to move quickly," Edward said, wheeling toward the study door, "before this room decides to make its own decisions about what happens next." Henry moved to grab his jacket. "Where are we going?" "The harbor," Edward said. "If Doyle is behind this, and if Isabel went there this morning, then whatever happens next, happens there, not here." Grace stood as well, tucking her notebook back into her bag. "I'm coming with you." "This isn't your fight," Edward said, though there was no real force behind the words, more habit than conviction. "With respect, Mr. Colton," Grace said evenly, "it became my fight the moment I chose to follow that car alone at dawn instead of simply reporting to work as usual. I did not spend 6 weeks gathering information just to hand it over and step aside." Edward studied her for a long moment, seeing for the first time not the quiet, invisible presence who had managed his household for 3 years, but someone who had shown more courage and clearer judgment in the past 6 weeks than most of the armed men currently standing guard throughout his estate. "Fine," he said, "but you stay close, and you do exactly as Henry instructs once we're there." Grace nodded, and the 3 of them moved quickly through a side corridor toward the estate's private garage, away from the chapel where 200 guests still waited, unaware that the missing bride they whispered about was, at this very moment, standing somewhere across the city, inside a plan built specifically to end everything Edward Colton had spent years rebuilding. The car ride to the harbor took 18 minutes, though it felt far longer to Edward, every red light and slow intersection stretching his patience thinner. Henry drove, while 2 additional security vehicles followed close behind, men Edward trusted enough to bring into a situation this uncertain, though he had given strict instructions that no one was to take any action without his direct word. Whatever Doyle was planning, Edward intended to understand the full picture before responding, unwilling to give his enemies the satisfaction of watching him react with the same recklessness they likely expected from a man freshly humiliated on his own wedding day. As the harbor district came into view, rows of old warehouses lining the water, their windows dark and cracked with age, Edward felt an unexpected calm settle over him, the same steady focus that had once made him one of the most respected and feared figures in the city's business world. The wheelchair beneath him had never been a weakness, no matter how many people assumed otherwise. It had simply forced him to fight his battles differently, with patience and precision rather than brute force, and today would prove no different. Henry slowed the car near an old loading dock, pointing toward a black sedan parked beside one of the warehouse entrances, its plates matching the vehicle from the gate footage exactly. "That's her car," Henry said quietly. Edward looked toward the warehouse, its large metal doors slightly open, a sliver of light visible from within despite the surrounding darkness of the abandoned district. Somewhere inside that building, the answers to everything, the truth about Isabel, about Doyle, and about exactly how close he had come to losing everything he had rebuilt, were waiting to be uncovered. "Let's go find out what we're really dealing with," Edward said, and Henry brought the car to a slow stop near the entrance. Henry helped guide Edward's chair over the uneven gravel leading to the warehouse entrance, while Grace walked close behind, her earlier calm now sharpened into quiet alertness. The two security vehicles parked a short distance away, their occupants staying back per Edward's instructions, watching the perimeter rather than crowding the entrance. Edward wanted answers, not a confrontation that could spiral into something neither side could control. Through the gap in the metal doors, voices drifted out into the cold evening air. Edward recognized one voice immediately, softer than he remembered, but unmistakably Isabel's. The second voice belonged to a man, older, rougher, carrying the particular confidence of someone who believed he had already won. "By tonight, none of it will matter," the man was saying. "Once the papers clear tomorrow morning, everything falls into place exactly as we planned." "And if he tries to fight it?" Isabel's voice asked, quieter, though Edward noted something in her tone that sounded less like affection lost and more like simple calculation, the voice of someone discussing logistics rather than heartbreak. "He won't be in any position to fight anything," the man answered. "A man confined to a chair, humiliated in front of every rival he has, abandoned on his wedding day. Nobody will follow him after this. By the time he realizes what's happened, we'll already control enough of his shipping contracts to make any objection meaningless." Edward felt Henry tense beside him, ready to move, but Edward raised a hand slightly, signaling patience. He needed to hear more, needed to understand exactly how deep this ran before deciding how to respond. "He trusted me completely," Isabel said, and for a brief moment, something almost like hesitation colored her voice. "He's not a bad man, Uncle. He never once treated me poorly." "That's precisely why this worked," the man replied, his tone hardening. "Kind men make careless decisions. He signed those documents without questioning why a joint account required your signature alongside his, for withdrawals above a certain amount. He never once asked why our lawyer suggested language allowing full transfer under incapacitation. He trusted you. And trust is the easiest weapon in the world to use against a man who has forgotten what it feels like to be betrayed." Edward had heard enough. He wheeled forward, pushing the warehouse door open fully with his own hands, the metal groaning against its old hinges, as light from outside spilled into the dim interior. Marcus Doyle turned first, his expression shifting from surprise to something colder within seconds. Isabel, standing beside a small table covered in documents and a laptop, froze completely, her face draining of color as she saw Edward sitting in the doorway, flanked by Henry and Grace. "Edward," Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You look surprised," Edward said, his tone even, betraying none of the anger burning beneath his calm exterior. "I would have thought a woman capable of planning something this elaborate might have prepared for the possibility that I would come looking for answers myself." "The stars timing foreign." Doyle stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Isabel, though his posture carried more calculation than protection. "Mr. Colton," he said, his voice carrying forced civility. "This is unfortunate timing. I assume you've come to discuss a misunderstanding." I've come to discuss exactly what I overheard through that door, Edward said. Incapacitation clauses, joint signatures, contracts designed to transfer my life's work into your hands the moment I became too broken to notice. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Doyle. That's a plan 5 years in the making, and I imagine it started the same month your own operation collapsed. Doyle's jaw tightened, any pretense of civility disappearing from his expression. You took everything from me once, he said. Contracts I built for a decade, partners I trusted, all of it dismantled because you decided my presence in this city's shipping business was inconvenient for your own expansion. I lost everything, Colton. My home, my reputation, nearly my family's safety. Do you understand what it feels like to watch everything you built disappear because one man decided you were simply in his way? I understand it better than you think, Edward said quietly. I lost the use of my own legs to a car that someone tampered with, back when men like you decided the easiest way to remove competition was to make sure they never walked into a boardroom again. I rebuilt everything from a wheelchair, Doyle, one difficult year at a time, while men like you assumed I was finished. Perhaps that's the difference between us. I chose to rebuild. You chose to wait 5 years for an opportunity to steal what someone else had already rebuilt. Isabel stepped forward slightly, her composure cracking for the first time since Edward had entered the room. It wasn't only about the money, she said. My uncle raised me after my parents passed. Everything he lost trying to provide for our family. When he asked me to help repair what your rise had cost us, I agreed because I owed him that much. And every moment we spent together, Edward said, his voice steady despite the ache tightening in his chest. Every conversation, every laugh, all of it was simply repayment of a debt to your uncle? Isabel did not answer immediately, and in her silence, Edward found the only honest response she had given him in over a year together. Grace stepped forward slightly from behind Edward's chair, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the room. The documents on that table, she said, nodding toward the small table covered in papers. Are they the finalized contracts, or simply drafts awaiting signatures? Doyle's eyes flicked toward Grace, clearly recognizing her from the estate, though uncertain how much she actually knew. Who is this? He asked Edward. Your assistant? The woman who uncovered your entire plan before anyone else in my household noticed anything was wrong, Edward said. I'd choose your next words carefully. Grace moved closer to the table, scanning the documents quickly, her trained eye for detail immediately identifying the relevant sections. These are drafts, she said after a moment, unsigned, which means nothing on this table currently holds any legal authority, regardless of what conversations took place here today. Doyle's expression shifted, calculation replacing confidence as he realized his plan had not yet reached the point of no return he believed it had. The wedding was simply the first step, he admitted, seeing little use in continuing the pretense. Isabel's signature alongside yours today would have activated the joint account provisions immediately. Without that ceremony completing, the documents remain exactly what your maid called them, drafts without power. Henry, standing close enough to intervene if necessary, glanced toward Edward, waiting for direction. Edward studied Doyle for a long moment, then turned his attention to Isabel, searching her face for any remaining trace of the woman he believed he had fallen in love with over the past year. You had every opportunity to simply ask me for help, Edward said quietly. If your family struggled after Doyle's collapse, if debts needed repaying, you could have come to me honestly. I've spent years rebuilding my own life, after losing everything that mattered to me physically. I would have understood better than most people what it feels like to watch your world collapse around you. Would you have believed me? Isabel asked. Or would you have simply seen another reason to distrust everyone who came near you? The question lingered in the cold warehouse air, and Edward found he had no immediate answer, uncertain himself whether honesty might have changed anything between them from the very beginning. Doyle, sensing the moment slipping away from him, moved slightly toward the table where the documents sat, perhaps hoping to gather them before Edward's men could act. Henry stepped forward immediately, positioning himself between Doyle and the table without a word, his presence alone enough to stop the older man in his tracks. You won't be taking anything out of this building, Henry said. This isn't your city anymore to control from a wheelchair, Doyle said, his composure finally cracking under the weight of a plan collapsing faster than he had anticipated. "You think rolling in here with 2 people changes anything? I have allies waiting on confirmation of today's signatures. The moment they realize the wedding failed, every debt I called in to arrange this will need repaying regardless." "Then perhaps you should have built your plan on something sturdier than a wedding ceremony and unsigned paperwork," Edward said. "I've spent years learning that any plan relying entirely on one perfect day, one signature, one moment where everything must go exactly as intended, is a plan built by someone who has never actually survived losing control of a situation. You built an entire scheme around a ceremony you assumed would proceed without complication. I built my recovery around assuming every single day would bring a new complication I needed to survive." Grace, still standing near the table, carefully photographed each document using her phone, working quickly and methodically despite the tension filling the room. "These will need to be reviewed by your legal team immediately," she said to Edward, "along with whatever records exist showing how these drafts were prepared and by whom." "Photograph everything," Edward confirmed. "Every page, every signature line, every date." Isabel watched Grace work, something like resignation settling over her features, as she realized the careful plan crafted over the better part of a year had unraveled, not because of any misstep on her part, but because a quiet household employee had simply refused to stop paying attention. "How long have you known?" Isabel asked Grace directly, the first time she had addressed her since Edward's arrival. "Long enough to gather everything necessary to protect the man I work for," Grace answered simply, without pride or malice in her tone, merely stating fact. "I did not set out looking for a conspiracy. I only noticed things that seemed inconsistent, and I chose not to ignore them simply because acknowledging them felt inconvenient." Doyle, realizing the documents alone would not be enough to salvage his position, attempted a different approach, his tone shifting towards something almost conciliatory. "Colton, perhaps there's still a path forward here that benefits us both. You maintain your empire, I receive fair compensation for the years your rise cost my family, and none of this needs to become public knowledge among the very people currently waiting at your chapel for answers." Edward studied him for a long moment, considering the offer not because he found it tempting, but because understanding exactly what Doyle valued most told him everything he needed about how to proceed. "You're offering me silence," Edward said, "in exchange for compensation. The same silence you were prepared to buy through my own incapacitation just hours ago. I think you misunderstand the position you're currently in, Mr. Doyle. You are not negotiating from strength. You are negotiating from a warehouse where 3 of my most trusted people just watched you admit, in detail, to orchestrating a plan meant to seize control of my life's work through fraudulent contracts and a marriage built entirely on deception. What exactly do you intend to do with that information?" Doyle asked, his voice tightening. Edward considered the question carefully. Years earlier, before the accident, his response to a betrayal of this magnitude might have been swift and severe, the kind of response that had once made his name feared throughout every warehouse and dock in the city. But the years spent rebuilding from a wheelchair had taught him something Doyle apparently never learned, that true power rarely required drama to enforce itself. Sometimes the most effective response was simply making sure the truth reached exactly the right people, allowing consequences to unfold naturally, rather than forcing them through fear. "I intend to let the truth do the work," Edward said finally. "Every rival, every ally, currently waiting at my chapel, came today under a truce built on respect between families, regardless of past conflicts. When they learn that you attempted to use a wedding, a sacred agreement between families, as cover for financial fraud, I doubt any of them will extend you the courtesy of continued business relationships. Reputation, Mr. Doyle, matters more in our world than any single contract ever could. You didn't just attempt to steal from me today. You attempted to weaponize the one tradition every family in that chapel still respects. That is not a betrayal easily forgiven or forgotten." Doyle's face paled slightly, understanding for the first time that Edward's calm demeanor represented something far more dangerous than the anger he had expected. A man who threatened violence could be negotiated with, avoided, or countered through equal force. A man who simply intended to let the truth spread through a network of powerful families held a weapon that no amount of money or leverage could easily undo. "Isabel," Edward said, turning his attention back to her, his voice softer now, though no less firm. Whatever debt you felt you owed your uncle, whatever loyalty kept you tied to this plan, I want you to understand something before we leave this building. I would have helped you, genuinely, and without condition, had you simply asked. Not because I am without flaws or suspicion, but because I know intimately what it feels like to lose everything, and need someone willing to help you rebuild. You chose deception instead of honesty, and in doing so, you lost the one person in this entire situation who might have actually helped you, without expecting anything in return. Isabel's eyes glistened, though whether from genuine regret or simply the realization that her plan had failed, Edward could not be certain, and for the first time in over a year together, he found he no longer needed to know the answer. Henry stepped forward, gesturing toward the warehouse entrance where the two security vehicles remained parked outside. "We should return to the estate," he said. "The guests are still waiting, and word of what's happening here will spread regardless of how carefully we try to manage it." Edward nodded, wheeling himself toward the door, Grace following close behind with her phone full of photographed evidence, the entire scope of Doyle's plan now documented in detail. Before leaving, Edward paused at the threshold, looking back once more at Doyle and Isabel standing together amid the scattered documents that represented months of careful planning, now reduced to nothing more than evidence against them. "I built an empire from a wheelchair that most people assumed would end my career the moment it happened," Edward said quietly. "You built a plan around the assumption that a broken man would be too grateful for affection to notice the mechanics of his own downfall. I think, in the end, that assumption was your greatest mistake." He wheeled through the door without waiting for a response, Henry and Grace close behind him, leaving Doyle and Isabel standing alone in the cold warehouse, with nothing left but the wreckage of a plan that had unraveled the moment a quiet household employee decided a pattern of small inconsistencies deserved closer attention. The drive back to the estate felt shorter than the journey out, though the weight pressing down on Edward's chest had only grown heavier with every passing mile. Henry drove in silence, occasionally glancing at Edward through the rearview mirror, uncertain what words might offer any real comfort after what they had just witnessed. Grace sat quietly beside Edward, reviewing the photographed documents on her phone, organizing them by date and content, preparing what she suspected would soon become evidence for lawyers rather than simply personal knowledge. "You did not have to come today," Edward said finally, breaking the silence as the estate gates came into view. "You could have simply handed me your notebook and let Henry handle whatever followed." "I considered that," Grace admitted, "but information without context rarely convinces anyone quickly enough when time matters most. I needed you to hear it directly from Doyle himself, not filtered through pages of my handwriting that you might have dismissed as speculation from someone with no real standing to make such accusations." Edward studied her for a moment, appreciating the clarity of her thinking, the same quality that had apparently allowed her to notice inconsistencies everyone else in his household, including trained security staff, had overlooked entirely. "You understand people better than most of the men I've paid considerable amounts of money to protect my interests," he said. "I simply pay attention," Grace said. "Most people stop noticing details once they decide someone is trustworthy. I never stopped noticing, regardless of how I felt about someone." The car pulled through the estate gates, and Edward could see the chapel still lit from within, guests gathered in small clusters across the courtyard, clearly having abandoned any pretense of an orderly wedding reception in favor of anxious waiting. As the car stopped, several guests turned toward it immediately, recognizing Edward's vehicle, murmurs rippling through the crowd as people realized their host had returned. Henry helped Edward from the car, and together with Grace, they moved toward the chapel entrance where the crowd had gathered thickest. Among the guests, Edward spotted several of the visiting family bosses standing together near the courtyard fountain, their expressions carefully neutral, though Edward recognized the particular stillness of men accustomed to reading tension before anyone spoke a single word. One of them, an older man named Frederick Osei, who had built his own considerable reputation over decades in the shipping trade, stepped forward first. "Edward," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for those nearby to hear clearly. "We've been waiting for some explanation. Several of us traveled considerable distances to attend this ceremony under an agreement of mutual respect. I trust whatever happened today has a satisfactory resolution." Edward looked out at the gathered crowd, understanding immediately that whatever he said next would shape not only how tonight concluded, but how his position within this world would be perceived for years to come. He could offer a vague explanation, protect his own dignity by keeping the full truth private, and hope the matter faded quietly with time. Or he could choose honesty, allowing the consequences to fall exactly where they belonged. "There will be no wedding today," Edward said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, silencing the scattered murmurs immediately. "The woman I intended to marry, along with her uncle, Marcus Doyle, orchestrated an elaborate plan to seize control of my business interests through fraudulent contracts, disguised as marriage arrangements. Had the ceremony proceeded as planned today, provisions within those contracts would have transferred significant portions of my operation into their control, activated specifically under circumstances involving my incapacitation." Gasps rippled through the assembled guests, several of the visiting bosses exchanging glances, clearly recalculating their own assumptions about the day's events. Frederick O'Sea's expression hardened considerably. "Doyle," he repeated, the name clearly familiar to him. "I remember him!" His collapse years ago was rumored to involve considerable dishonesty toward his own partners, long before any of this. Where is he now? "Still at the harbor as far as I know," Edward said. "I saw no reason to detain him myself. I imagine word of what happened here will travel through the appropriate channels far more effectively than anything I could arrange personally." A murmur of understanding passed through the crowd, several of the older guests nodding slowly, recognizing the particular kind of justice Edward intended to deliver, one built not on immediate confrontation, but on the slow, inevitable consequence of a man's reputation collapsing among people who valued trust above almost everything else. "You could have kept this private," Frederick said quietly, stepping closer to Edward. "Many men in your position would have preferred to protect their own image rather than admit publicly that they nearly fell victim to such a scheme." "I considered that," Edward admitted, "but every person standing in this courtyard came here today trusting that our families could set aside old conflicts for a single afternoon, out of respect for tradition. Doyle attempted to use that same tradition, that same trust, as a weapon against me. I think everyone here deserves to know exactly how far he was willing to go, if only so that none of you find yourselves facing something similar in the future." Frederick studied Edward for a long moment, something like genuine respect settling into his expression. "That is a wiser response than most men your age would manage," he said. "Doyle will find very few doors open to him after tonight, I imagine." "That was my intention," Edward said simply. As the crowd began to disperse slowly, guests moving in small groups to discuss what they had just witnessed, several approached Edward directly to offer quiet words of support, some clearly relieved that the truce holding the day together had not shattered into open conflict, despite the dramatic turn of events. Others simply nodded respectfully before departing, understanding instinctively that whatever personal humiliation Edward had suffered today, his handling of the crisis had only strengthened rather than diminished his standing among them. Grace remained close throughout, though she said little, allowing Edward the space to manage the aftermath among his peers without drawing attention to her own role in uncovering the plot. It was only once the courtyard had mostly emptied, the last of the guests departing into the evening, that Edward turned to her directly. "Everyone in that courtyard just watched me admit to nearly being deceived by a woman I trusted completely," Edward said. "Yet not one person questioned my judgment or my ability to lead. Do you understand why that is?" Grace considered the question seriously before answering. "Because you handled the crisis with more composure and clarity than most men manage, even when nothing has gone wrong at all," she said. "People do not judge leaders by whether mistakes happen. They judge leaders by how quickly and honestly those mistakes are addressed once discovered." Edward nodded slowly, appreciating once again the clarity Grace brought to even the most complicated situations. "You gave me that composure," he said. "If you had not followed that car this morning, if you had not spent 6 weeks quietly gathering evidence while everyone around me, myself included, remained completely unaware, I would have signed those documents this afternoon, believing I was marrying someone who loved me, rather than someone executing a calculated plan 5 years in the making." "I only did what seemed reasonable given what I noticed," Grace said, though there was something in her tone suggesting she understood the significance of what she had accomplished, even if she remained reluctant to claim credit for it directly. Henry, standing nearby, cleared his throat slightly. For what it's worth, he said, addressing Grace directly. I should have listened when you tried to schedule those meetings. I assumed you wanted to discuss budgets, and I dismissed something that turned out to be considerably more important. I'm sorry for that. You had no reason to assume otherwise, Grace said gently. I am, after all, simply the household staff. Most people in your position would have made the same assumption. Edward studied her closely, something shifting in his understanding of the woman who had spent 3 years managing his household with quiet efficiency, never once drawing attention to herself despite clearly possessing sharper judgment than nearly everyone else currently employed within his organization. That assumption ends tonight, Edward said firmly. Whatever role you've held within this household until now, it no longer accurately reflects what you've proven yourself capable of today. Grace looked at him, uncertain exactly what he meant, though something in his tone suggested this conversation was far from finished, and that the events of this long, unraveling day had changed far more than simply the fate of a wedding that would never take place. The days following the collapsed wedding moved quickly, each one bringing new developments that confirmed just how thoroughly Doyle's plan had unraveled the moment Edward walked into that harbor warehouse. Edward's lawyers reviewed the photographed documents within hours, confirming that the draft contracts contained language even more troubling than Grace had initially suspected, clauses that would have granted Isabel authority over key business decisions long before any incapacitation clause ever needed activating. Had the marriage proceeded, Edward realized, he might have found his own authority slowly eroding within months, long before Doyle needed to force any dramatic confrontation at all. Word of what happened at the harbor spread through the city's business circles exactly as Edward had predicted, carried not through any deliberate effort on his part, but through the natural gossip network that connected every family and business interest across the docks and warehouses. Frederick Osei, true to his word, made no secret of his own disapproval regarding Doyle's methods, and within a week, several of Doyle's remaining business contacts severed their relationships entirely, unwilling to risk their own reputations by association with a man who had attempted to weaponize a wedding ceremony for financial fraud. Doyle himself disappeared from the city again, much as he had 5 years earlier following his original collapse, though this time Edward suspected there would be no quiet return, no second attempt at rebuilding influence within a business world that valued trust and reputation above almost everything else. Isabel's fate remained less clear for several weeks, rumors suggesting she had left the country entirely, choosing distance over facing the consequences of a plan that had ultimately failed to protect either her uncle's interests or her own future. Edward found himself surprisingly unbothered by her absence, the initial sting of betrayal fading more quickly than he expected, replaced instead by a strange clarity about what he had actually wanted from the relationship in the first place. He had wanted to feel whole again after the accident, wanted someone who saw him as more than a man confined to a chair, wanted proof that his condition had not diminished his ability to be loved. Isabel had offered him exactly that illusion, convincingly enough that he had never questioned why the affection felt, in retrospect, slightly rehearsed, slightly too perfectly calibrated to exactly what he needed to hear. Grace, meanwhile, continued managing the household with the same quiet efficiency she always had, though something had shifted subtly in how the rest of the staff treated her, a new respect evident in small gestures, colleagues seeking her opinion on matters they previously would have handled without consultation. Henry, in particular, made a point of including her in security briefings that would have previously remained entirely separate from household management, acknowledging without needing to say so directly that her judgment had proven more valuable than anyone had previously credited. 2 weeks after the collapsed wedding, Edward called Grace into his study, the same room where they had first reviewed the gate camera footage together on that chaotic afternoon. She arrived promptly, as always, though Edward noticed she still carried herself with the same understated composure she always had, no different despite everything that had changed around her. "Sit down," Edward said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Grace sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap, waiting for him to continue. "I've spent the past 2 weeks thinking carefully about what happened," Edward said. "Not just about Isabel and Doyle, though certainly about them as well, but about how completely I failed to notice what was happening in my own household, in my own relationship, over the better part of a year. And I've been thinking about how you noticed everything, quietly, methodically, without any resources beyond your own attention and judgment." I only did what seemed necessary, Grace said, the same modest response she had given multiple times over the past 2 weeks, whenever anyone praised her role in uncovering the plot. I understand that you believe that, Edward said, but I want you to understand something clearly. What you did required more than simple attention. It required courage to keep investigating, even when your attempts to warn me were repeatedly dismissed or rescheduled. It required judgment sharp enough to recognize a pattern most trained security professionals in this household completely missed. And it required loyalty strong enough that you were willing to follow a car alone at dawn, without backup, without certainty about what you might find, simply because you believed something was wrong and refused to ignore it. Grace remained quiet, listening carefully, though Edward could see something shifting slightly in her expression, an acknowledgement perhaps that the significance of her actions was beginning to settle in fully for the first time. I want to offer you a different position within this organization, Edward continued, not household management, though I understand if you wish to continue in that role if it suits you better. I'm asking you to consider becoming my personal advisor, someone whose judgment I consult directly on matters both personal and professional, someone with the authority to challenge my decisions when you believe I'm making a mistake, rather than someone whose warnings get rescheduled by well-meaning staff who assume you only want to discuss budgets. Grace's composure finally cracked slightly, genuine surprise crossing her features. Mr. Colton, she said carefully, I have no formal training in business or security. I managed a household. I am not qualified for a position of that significance. You uncovered a 5-year plan orchestrated by an experienced businessman and his niece. A plan sophisticated enough that it nearly succeeded despite my own considerable experience and caution, Edward said. You did this using nothing more than careful observation and a notebook you carried in your bag. I have advisors with decades of formal training who missed everything you noticed within 6 weeks. I think qualification, in this case, has very little to do with formal credentials and everything to do with judgment, and yours has proven itself more reliable than almost anyone else currently in my employ. Grace considered his words carefully, the silence stretching for a long moment as she weighed the magnitude of what he was offering against her own uncertainty about stepping into a role so different from anything she had previously held. If I accept, she said finally, I would want assurance that my concerns, whatever they may be in the future, receive your direct attention, rather than being filtered through assistants who might dismiss them as unimportant. You have my word, Edward said. Whatever concerns you bring to me from this point forward, you'll have my direct attention, regardless of how minor or significant they might initially seem. Grace nodded slowly, something settling into her expression that looked almost like quiet resolve. Then I accept, she said. Edward felt something ease in his chest, a sense that despite everything that had gone wrong over the past year, despite the humiliation of his own wedding collapsing in front of every important figure in his professional world, he had gained something far more valuable than what he had lost. He had gained an ally whose loyalty had already been tested under circumstances few people ever faced, and who had proven, without any doubt, that her judgment could be trusted completely. That evening, as Grace prepared to leave the study, she paused at the doorway, turning back toward Edward one final time. Can I ask you something? She said, now that our roles have changed. Of course, Edward said. Why did you never ask why a woman like Isabel never asked about your recovery? Grace said. You must have noticed the same absence I did, long before I ever said anything at the chapel. Edward considered the question honestly, unwilling to offer her anything less than the truth now that she had earned it so thoroughly. I think, he said slowly, I was too grateful that she never treated me as broken to notice that she also never treated me as fully human, with fears and pain worth asking about. I wanted so badly to feel normal again that I mistook her indifference to my struggles for acceptance of them. Grace nodded, understanding settling into her expression. Sometimes, she said, the people who truly see us are not the ones who ignore our wounds, but the ones who ask about them anyway, even when it would be easier not to. She left the study quietly, and Edward sat alone for a long while afterward, turning her words over in his mind, understanding for the first time in years that the woman who had spent 3 years asking quiet questions about his schedule, his appointments, and his well-being, had perhaps understood him more completely than anyone he had ever tried to build a future with. 3 months passed, and the business world that had once buzzed with gossip about the collapsed wedding moved on to newer scandals, though Edward's reputation, rather than suffering from the humiliation of that afternoon, had only strengthened considerably. Business partners who once quietly questioned whether a man in his condition could continue leading effectively now spoke of him with renewed respect, impressed by how swiftly and cleanly he had exposed and dismantled a plot that could have destroyed him entirely. Grace settled into her new role with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, though Edward noticed she approached the position differently than his previous advisors had. Where others had often told him what they believed he wanted to hear, Grace never hesitated to challenge his decisions when her judgment differed from his, always calmly, always with clear reasoning, never simply for the sake of disagreement. Within weeks, Edward found himself relying on her perspective before finalizing any significant decision, her steady presence becoming as essential to his operation as Henry's security expertise had always been. It was on an otherwise ordinary Thursday afternoon that the last remnant of Doyle's plan resurfaced, arriving in the form of a phone call from one of Edward's shipping contacts, a man named Julian Ferris, who managed several of the smaller accounts along the eastern docks. Grace took the call first, as she often did now, screening matters before determining what required Edward's direct attention. "Julian says someone approached one of our smaller clients last week," Grace reported, entering Edward's study with her tablet in hand. "Someone offering better rates on shipping contracts suspiciously similar to terms we currently hold, undercutting our pricing just enough to tempt a client who's been with us for years." Edward looked up from the paperwork on his desk. "Did Julian get a name?" "A company called Harborline Logistics," Grace said, scrolling through her notes. "Registered only 4 months ago, coincidentally around the same time Doyle's plan was falling apart at that warehouse." Edward felt a familiar tightness settle in his chest, though this time it carried none of the shock or betrayal from 3 months earlier, only the weary recognition of a threat he had genuinely hoped was finished. "Doyle again," he said. "Possibly," Grace said carefully. "Or possibly someone connected to him, finishing what he started using resources he managed to hide before disappearing. I've requested registration records for Harborline. We should know more within a day or 2. True to her prediction, the registration records arrived the following afternoon, revealing that Harborline Logistics had been established using funds traced back to an account Grace recognized immediately from her earlier research, an account linked to one of the associates who had visited Edward's estate through the back gate months earlier, one of the men Grace had noted in her original notebook without ever learning his full identity at the time. "His name is Gerald Whitfield," Grace said, presenting the findings to Edward and Henry during a brief meeting in the study. "A former business partner of Doyle's, from years before his collapse. It appears Whitfield managed to avoid the reputational damage that followed Doyle afterward, likely because his involvement in the original collapse was never publicly connected to him. And now he's trying to finish what Doyle started," Henry said, "using contracts and pricing rather than marriage schemes." "It appears so," Grace confirmed, "though this approach carries considerably less risk for him personally. If he simply undercuts our pricing gradually, client by client, there's no dramatic confrontation required, no elaborate scheme that can unravel all at once. It's a slower plan but a harder one to expose cleanly." Edward considered the situation carefully, recognizing in Whitfield's approach something far more patient than Doyle's rushed and ultimately reckless scheme. Where Doyle had wanted quick, decisive control through marriage and incapacitation clauses, Whitfield appeared content to simply erode Edward's client base gradually, client by client, contract by contract, until the damage became significant enough to matter without ever requiring a single dramatic moment that might expose his involvement. "What would you suggest?" Edward asked Grace directly, testing the confidence he had placed in her judgment against a genuinely difficult strategic problem. Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Doyle's plan failed because it depended entirely on secrecy and a single decisive moment," she said. "Whitfield's plan depends on patience and gradual erosion. I think the answer, then, is to remove his patience by making the cost of continuing immediately and visibly higher than any potential gain." "Meaning?" Henry asked. "Meaning we don't wait for him to slowly convince our clients one by one," Grace said. "We reach out to those same clients directly, transparently, and explain exactly why Harborline Logistics can currently offer such competitive rates. Namely, that the company exists specifically to undermine legitimate competitors, using funds connected to a previous fraud scheme. Most reputable clients value stability and honesty over marginal savings, particularly once they understand the full context behind the pricing. Edward smiled slightly, recognizing in Grace's suggestion the same clear thinking that had uncovered Doyle's original plan months earlier.
You want to remove his advantage by exposing his motivation before he ever gets the chance to fully establish it.
Precisely, Grace said. Whitfield is betting that our clients will simply see better pricing without asking why it exists. If we make certain they understand why, before he ever gets the opportunity to build genuine trust with them, his entire strategy collapses before it truly begins. Over the following 2 weeks, Edward's team reached out quietly to each client Julian had identified as a target of Whitfield's outreach, explaining the situation with careful transparency rather than dramatic accusation, simply presenting the documented connection between Harborline Logistics and the previous fraud attempt at Edward's own wedding. As Grace predicted, most clients responded not with suspicion toward Edward, but with appreciation for his honesty, several even providing additional details about their conversations with Whitfield's representatives that helped build an even clearer picture of his intentions. Within a month, Harborline Logistics quietly dissolved, its funding sources apparently unwilling to continue supporting a venture that had failed to gain any meaningful traction once its true purpose became known throughout the shipping community. Whitfield himself disappeared from public business dealings entirely, following the same pattern Doyle had established years earlier, retreating into obscurity rather than facing the consequences of exposure within a world that valued reputation above almost everything else. Edward called Grace into his study once the matter had fully resolved, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the same desk where they had first reviewed gate camera footage together months earlier.
You handled that entire situation better than I would have,
Edward admitted. I would have wanted to confront Whitfield directly, the way I confronted Doyle. You found a way to defeat him without ever needing to speak to him at all. Different threats require different responses, Grace said simply. Doyle wanted a confrontation, wanted to see fear or anger in your reaction. Whitfield wanted quiet, patient erosion. The only way to defeat patience is with clarity, delivered faster than he expected, removing his advantage before he ever realized it was gone. Edward studied her for a long moment, appreciating once again the depth of judgment she brought to every situation, judgment that had proven itself repeatedly over these past months, in ways that went far beyond what any of his previous advisors had ever offered him. I've been thinking about something, Edward said. The day of the wedding, you asked me why Isabel never asked about my recovery, my pain, my fears. I've realized since then that you were the only person in my household who consistently asked those questions, quietly, without any expectation of recognition, for 3 years before any of this happened. Grace remained quiet, listening carefully. I spent a year convinced that Isabel understood me, because she never treated me as broken, Edward continued. But you understood something more important. You never treated my condition as something to be ignored or celebrated. You simply asked, consistently, how I was actually doing, and you listened to the answers carefully enough to notice when something in my life felt wrong, whether that wrongness came from within my own body or from someone standing close enough to hurt me. I only did what seemed like basic care, Grace said. I never expected it to matter as much as it apparently has. It mattered more than anything else that happened this year, Edward said. Real strength, I've come to understand, was never about whether I could walk into a room on my own 2 legs. It was about whether the people standing beside me actually saw me clearly, pain and all, rather than simply seeing what they needed me to be for their own purposes. Outside the study window, the estate grounds stretched quiet and peaceful in the late afternoon light, the chaos of the collapsed wedding, and the quiet threat that followed both fully resolved now, tucked away as difficult chapters in a story that had ultimately strengthened rather than diminished everything Edward had worked years to rebuild. Whatever comes next, Edward said, whatever new threat rises from whatever remains of Doyle's old network, I know now that I'm not facing it from a position of weakness, and I'm certainly not facing it alone. Grace allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the first Edward had seen from her since this entire ordeal began months earlier. "Then let's make sure whatever comes next," she said, "finds us exactly as prepared as we were today." Edward nodded, watching the late afternoon light fade slowly across the estate grounds, understanding fully now that the wedding day he had once feared would define him as broken and abandoned had instead revealed something far more valuable: the quiet, steady loyalty of someone who had been standing beside him all along, simply waiting for the moment when he was finally ready to truly see her.